Good news. Shen Yunchu has been reborn. Bad news. Her crown prince's ex-husband is also. Body delicate, body soft, heart trick little white rabbit versus crazy criticism of the prince due to mouth mismatch, 1v1 plus double cleanliness. In his previous life, Shen Yunchu and Ji married into the Eastern Palace. The first time I saw Bai Yuheng was when he lifted her red cap with the scale in his hand in the new house. Shen Yunchu appears gentle on the surface, but in his heart. Old man, can you do it? Bai Yuheng's eyebrows and heart twitched slightly as she could read her heart. Her inner OS was only 23, very old. Later on, everyone knew that the crown princess was frail and bedridden for 8 out of 10 days. Shen Yunchu said, born for your highness, died for your highness, and went through fire and water for your highness. Inner OS. Dog man, why are you catching me alone? Ho ho. In an accident, the always loyal Shen family turned around without warning. Shen Yunchu. Sleeping in bed, won't a dog man kill me? Later on, she really died, but it was on the way that Xiong came to pick her up and leave. To be honest, I was unlucky to be caught by Bai Yuheng and shot to death by arrows on the spot along with him. Opening her eyes again, she was reborn and nothing had happened yet. This time, she will take it step by step to save her family and water and fire. When she accidentally met the fierce gaze of the young man Heng, who was not his age, Shen Yunchu. Isn't it? Is it so much fun? By chance, she found that she could hear Bai Yuheng's inner voice. Bai Yuheng OS. Kill her, never suffer again. Shen Yunchu. My life is at rest after a while, Bai Yuheng OS. Forget it, we can't run anyway, we'll kill in a few days. Shen Yunchu. Scared to death, live another day. Keywords of the novel. After being reborn, the character of the crown prince and his husband collapses without a pop-up window. After being reborn, the character of the crown prince and his husband collapses. Download the complete text. After being reborn, the character of the crown prince and his husband collapses. Read the latest chapter. Is it reasonable for you to listen to chapter 1 yourself? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Is it reasonable for you to listen to chapter 1 yourself? The magnificent palace is adorned with music, the sleeves of dancers fluttering, the red silk fluttering in the wind, and palace attendants carrying jade and fine wine walking through the main hall in an orderly manner. At the banquet, the music of Qi Tian overshadowed the noisy conversations of adults around him. Shen Yunchu sat in the front seat with his father, who was busy drinking with the emperor and had no time to ask her. His mother complained of illness and stayed at home to recuperate, but did not attend together. She has never liked such noisy occasions, but her father is a general who is highly trusted by Emperor Shingen. No matter what the occasion, her father is indispensable to accompany her. Moreover, today is the emperor's birthday, and as soon as you are happy, you naturally have to raise your glass and talk. Shen Yunchu obediently sat in her seat, yawning in boredom, and tears welled up from the corner of her eyes. She reached out and rubbed her eyes. I'm really tired. She half closed her eyes, and suddenly a clear voice pierced through the surrounding noise, straight into her ear. I'm so bored that I yawn, so silly, so cute. Who is speaking? Shen Yunchu was taken aback. His voice sounded a bit like Prince Bai Yuheng. Realizing this, her mind exploded with a buzzing sound, and she instantly lost all sleep. However, upon closer reflection, with his cold and gloomy personality, which was so cold that no living creatures could be seen within 10 miles, she couldn't say such words. You should know that in his previous life, Shen Yunchu married into the Eastern Palace at the age of Ji and slept with him for 5 years. She couldn't help but recognize his voice. Yes, Shen Yunchu was reborn. One day 3 months ago, she was the crown princess who was shot dead by a stray arrow. When she opened her eyes again, she returned to the day when she stumbled and fell into the water at the age of 10 and was rescued. Bai Yuheng is a person with a gloomy and indifferent temperament. In Shen Yunchu's impression, every time he sees him, he feels like a sky covered in a layer of dark clouds. Wherever he goes, he is filled with a terrifying sense of oppression, inexplicably making people dare not take a breath. This dog man not only has a strange temperament, doesn't like to talk, is cruel and unreasonable, but whenever he feels any displeasure, he will call his head to the ground. Killing someone directly is considered benevolent, torturing and offending them is a very systematic approach. Cutting hands and feet, digging eyes and tongues are common practices, and some even peel off their skin without causing them to die immediately. The key is that her energy is not usually strong, causing her to be bedridden for 8 out of 10 days is a common occurrence, and she still has to rely on the few days during the month to avoid it. She once thought that if it were to happen again, no matter how much the family persuaded her, she would not agree to marry her father for the family honor and future he had spoken of. Shen Yunchu raised his eyes in confusion, his inquisitive gaze piercing through the gaps in the crowd and passing through the dancing girls swaying in the center of the stage, landing on the crown prince Bai Yuheng sitting in the first position across from him. He still has a handsome face, dressed in bright yellow brocade, with white wristbands lining his straight and slender forearms. The dragon-patterned jade hanging from his waist is crystal clear, and he sits there with a straight back. The clear contours of his cheeks were tinged with a hint of coldness, and besides the innate noble aura of the imperial family, there was also a faint sense of awe between his eyebrows. At the age of 18, he was full of youthful energy, more energetic and human than the gloomy and fierce person in Shen Yunchu's memory. He lowered his eyes and drank quietly, his face as cold as ever. Someone came up with a glass, but without exception, he was stopped by the guards beside him. He was still as cold and proud as Shen Yunchu had imagined. Shen Yunchu breathed a sigh of relief and thought, it must be an illusion. In the next moment, before she could even move her eyes, Bai Yuheng suddenly lifted his eyes and looked over. The two of them caught their eyes off guard and met. At the moment when their eyes met, Shen Yunchu's breath stopped and he quickly lowered his eyes. It's so close, I'm scared to death. Before Shen Yunchu could react, she heard his voice again. Did she just look at me? Did I scare her? She wouldn't think I was fierce, would she? Why is she only 10 years old? I want to ask the imperial decree to marry her now. Forget it, it's too young. If I marry and take care of myself, what should I do if I can't help it? Let's keep it at the general's mansion. When it's time, I'll marry her and kill Shen Jichang. It's like killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Shen Yunchu stared blankly at the wine glass on the small table in front of him, his mind buzzing and blank. Wait a moment, what's the situation? What is the word tiger and wolf? The amount of information is a bit large, and the threads are first. Firstly, Shen Jichang is her father. Secondly, what Bai Yuheng means is to marry her and then kill her father. Shen Yunchu said, is it reasonable for you to listen to this for yourself? She suppressed the surprise and terror in her heart, and forced her calm gaze to scan the courtiers around her who were still drinking and joking as usual, confirming that she was still at the palace banquet. Suddenly, within her reach, she caught a glimpse of a red shadow. The dignified woman lightly moved her lotus steps, her slender and fair fingers gripping a wine glass, and slowly walked towards Bai Yuheng. Shen Yunchu remembers her, Princess Yulan, Bai Yuheng. In the previous life, she was rumored to be a woman that Bai Yuheng would never forget, like a white moonlight. Although they are siblings, they have no blood relationship. Bai Yuheng was brought back from the people by the emperor during his early expedition. It is said that the emperor was trapped in the woods for several days and could not find an exit. Just as everyone was in despair, they suddenly heard the cry of a baby. They searched for the cry and unexpectedly walked out of the woods and found a baby abandoned on the roadside, still in its infancy. Therefore, the Emperor Longyan was overjoyed and felt that it was a blessing from heaven, so he brought it back to the palace and gave it the name Wanning in the title Yulan, which could be described as a kind of indulgence. Bai Yuheng did not disappoint the emperor's cultivation. She was diligent and eager to learn from a young age, proficient in all 18 martial arts, and had a beautiful appearance. It is said that there is no man in Xing'an who does not bow down to her red skirt. She stood still in front of Bai Yuheng, raised her wine glass in her hand, and separated from the stage and the group of dancers, surrounded by commotion. Shen Yunchu probably couldn't hear what they were saying. But strangely enough, Bai Yuheng's voice came back in his ear. This woman is so annoying. She always comes to talk to me, and soon she will start spreading rumors that I like her. Su has never been very smart about this kind of thing, may she misunderstand again. What is not smart? Who's not smart? Su is Shen Yunchu's nickname, and people close to her like to call her that. However, in his previous life, after 5 years of marriage, Shen Yunchu had never heard him call her that way. What is this person up to? My brain is broken. After confirming that he could hear Bai Yuheng's voice, Shen Yunchu picked up the tea cup at hand and wanted to take a sip to suppress his shock, but before he could swallow a sip of tea, he almost sprayed it out. She coughed a few times, but managed to hold back. Looking up again, the singing and dancing on stage came to a stop. The dancers slowly withdrew and a new group of dancers came in. On the other side, Bai Yuheng had a calm expression, with a cold and distant expression on his face. However, Bai Yuheng, who came to chat with him, was not very cold either, only furrowing her brows slightly. Bai Yuheng didn't mind, and even asked the person next to her to make room for her. She sat next to Bai Yuheng and occasionally invited him to raise a glass. Shen Yunchu calmed her mind and breathed a long sigh of relief. If it weren't for the current situation being inappropriate, she even wanted to slap herself to calm her messy heart. Strange voices followed one after another. What should I do? I really want to escape, I don't want to talk to this woman. A person's face is like a snake's heart, creating a king's rhyme. It's not like a pastry, except for a broken mouth, everything else is fine. But I cannot refuse. If I refuse, the old man will definitely use the topic to blame me. Shen Yunchu was stunned, his mouth broken. Where did she break her mouth? During the 5 years of marrying into the Eastern Palace, she was widely recognized as gentle and obedient. He always asked and answered her questions, never saying much. He said 1, but she never said 2. He even said her mouth was broken. I don't know who broke his lips, but since I could hear his inner voice just now, he hasn't stopped, and his aura of not being close to strangers on the surface is too different. In a moment of surprise, she silently grasped the cup in her hand tighter and tighter, pretending to be calm on the surface. However, upon second thought, her heart suddenly exploded again. It turned out that the rumored white moonlight was actually fake, written and played by Bai Yuheng. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Collapse, all collapse. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2. Collapse, all collapse. No wonder in the previous life, whenever someone mentioned Bai Yuheng in front of him, he would have a black face. Shen Yunchu always thought that he had been ordered to marry her as the main wife, so he couldn't marry Bai Yuheng, and he didn't want to wrongly treat her as a concubine. He was unwilling and couldn't let go of it, so he could only bury it deep in his heart. That's why he couldn't hear anyone mention it in front of him. But now it seems that it's not what she thought. She originally thought that delicate princesses like Bai Yuheng, who were arrogant and aloof, would disdain using this method to kidnap men, but unfortunately, this man is the decisive Bai Yuheng. However, it cannot be denied that in the eyes of the world, they are simply a pair of talented and beautiful women, made in heaven and earth, both capable of both literature and martial arts, without distinction between high and low. At the hunting ground, they worked together to shoot and kill a fierce tiger that suddenly broke into the field, saving everyone in water and fire. They became famous overnight, almost writing the word matching on their faces. Unfortunately, it was not known later whether he had been instigated by the empress. In the end, Emperor Shingen forcibly separated the two, and Bai Yuheng was sent to a foreign country for marriage, and Shen Yunchu and Bai Yuheng were given marriage. Although there is such a saying, it is not that Shen Yunchu is not bad. After all, she is also the legitimate daughter of the general's mansion. In terms of talent and appearance, she is not inferior to Bai Yuheng at all, and is also worthy of Bai Yuheng. Her body is just too delicate. Bai Yuheng is capable of both literature and martial arts. She can only be literary, but martial arts are not enough. It's not that she lacks talent, it's just that her body is weak. She has read a lot of books, from her unparalleled skills in military strategy in martial arts to her poetry, songs, and storytelling. No matter which subject she is interested in, she can recite a few sentences and even talk to experts in the industry. Mainly because she and Bai Yuheng are completely different people. Bai Yuheng is ruthless, cruel, and ruthless, and his actions are never measured. Shen Yunchu has a gentle temperament, a pure and kind heart, likes tranquility, and is also slow and organized. He has been a neighbor girl since childhood. So, in the previous life, everyone felt that Shen Yunchu and Bai Yuheng could be implicated, and it was true that Yue Lao had gone astray and pulled the wrong line. But in fact, everyone knows that Bai Yuheng is the son of the late empress, and even the emperor is afraid of this son who is not close to him. The Shen family has been loyal to Emperor Shingen for generations, and Shen Jichang is his confidant. The purpose of Emperor Shingen's marriage to Shen Yunchu was self-evident, which was nothing more than to restrain Bai Yuheng. Unfortunately, she had not yet had time to play her role when she received news that the Shen family had conspired against her and asked her to leave overnight. She was very careful when she left, but was still discovered by Bai Yuheng. At the meeting place with her elder brother, she was shot dead by arrows from Emperor Shingen. Shen Yunchu was feeling a bit lost when Bai Yuheng's voice came to his ears again. I want to talk to Su Su. It would be great if the person who took the initiative to talk to me was Su Su, but she doesn't even look at me now. Why doesn't she look at me? She was still looking at me just now, so there can't be anyone here who looks even better than me. This noisy voice instantly pulled Shen Yunchu back to reality. What a sin. Although he is right in thinking so, whether in this life or the previous life, Bai Yuheng's appearance is one of the best in the entire Shingen. But why didn't he know this guy was so narcissistic before? She had intended to pretend not to hear and drink tea calmly on her face, but the next second she said, why doesn't she still look at me? Come over and talk to me, so that I don't have to deal with that stinky woman. Come here quickly. Come over quickly. He's really annoying. Shen Yunchu's eyebrows twitched slightly, secretly praying to himself that this absurd banquet would end soon. Come here. Come here. She tried to restrain her trembling hands and picked up the teacup on the table. Before she could even bring it to her mouth, she heard those two words pouring into her ear like spells. Come, come, come. Who can bear this? It's really so hard to hear even when you cover your ears with both hands. Shen Yunchu grabbed the hand of the teacup and paused. The tea in her hand was either drunk or not. Her ears and mind were filled with those two words, and she couldn't ignore them even if she wanted to. It's really noisy. With a loud bang, Shen Yunchu slammed the teacup in his hand onto the table in front of him. The people beside him were startled and threw puzzled glances at her, but she had no intention of asking. Until she stood up holding the cup, Bai Yuheng's voice suddenly came to an end, but she stood still, her feet heavy as if they had been filled with lead. Are you really going over? Thinking of her past life, she felt a faint unease and hesitated. She frowned and didn't want to go, but was really annoyed by him. In thought, she still held her cup and slowly walked through the crowd, circling around from under the stage. Before approaching, Bai Yuheng's inner voice rang out again. Has she come? She has really come. What should I say later? It's our first formal meeting and we shouldn't be too enthusiastic, Otherwise it will make me feel like the crown prince has no one to insist on her. Yes, it's better to be a bit cold and not too abrupt. Shen Yunchu suppressed the twitching corners of his mouth and thought to himself, there is nothing more abrupt than hearing your voice. If it weren't for the order of Emperor Shengyan, she wouldn't have left the banquet at will today. She had already made an excuse to leave. Shen Yunchu looked up at him, but he still drank the wine with a gloomy expression on his face, so cold that he didn't even lift his eyelids. Seeing Shen Yunchu getting closer and closer to him, he appeared calm on the surface, but couldn't help but feel ecstatic inside. Think quickly, say something good. She's about to come over. Shen Yunchu's footsteps paused, and she dared to glance at Bai Yuheng, who was tightly holding the wine glass with a gloomy and aloof expression. After a brief hesitation, she turned her head to look at Bai Yuheng beside Bai Yuheng. My daughter Shen Yunchu, I have seen the eldest royal highness princess. Shen Yunchu respectfully blessed his body, and the inner voice in his ears suddenly stopped. In this moment, Shen Yunchu felt an unprecedented tranquility, and then silently took a long breath. It seemed that all he needed was to help him get rid of Bai Yuheng's entanglement. Bai Yuheng withdrew her smile from her face and turned to look at Shen Yunchu. After her scrutinizing gaze wandered around her, she handed her a kind smile and said, I know you. Is there anything wrong? Shen Yunchu stroked his sleeve and knelt down on the ground, looking at her with expectant and adoring eyes. Sure enough, when it came to such things, Bai Yuheng looked at her and the distance in her eyes instantly faded. I didn't expect that Miss Shen, at a young age, would also study military strategy. Shen Yunchu lowered his eyes and smiled, then opened his mouth. Before he could say anything, Bai Yuheng's voice came to his ears again. The Book of War. Does the Book of War look good like a king? Why did you come to find her instead of me? I also have many books on military strategy. If you like Su Su, as long as Su Su speaks, I will give you all. Why do you have to ask that stinky woman? Is sitting here with such a big person like me a decoration? Does he seem a bit angry? The smile on Shen Yunchu's face stiffened a bit, and this sudden voice almost disrupted her originally planned speech. After a moment of silence, Shen Yunchu gritted his head and calmly answered Bai Yuheng's words, it's not even a study, it's just that my father doesn't even let me watch it at home, but I'm really interested. I have heard that the Royal Highness Princess is an expert in this field for a long time, and has a lot of research in this field. My daughter has long wanted to ask you for advice. Unfortunately, it is rare to see the princess on weekdays. Today's opportunity is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, so I took this opportunity to borrow it and take a look. Would it be convenient for the princess? Before receiving a response from Bai Yuheng's inner voice sounded first. What kind of research can she have? What are the things in her mansion that I asked for? What kind of vision? Obviously, I am the one who is both civil and military. Freshly produced. Ladies and gentlemen, take your time. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. As long as you speak, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. As long as you speak. Shen Yunchu cautiously glanced at him and saw the man sitting next to him with a cold and terrifying expression. He lowered his eyes and drank alone, as if he couldn't see Shen Yunchu at all. If it weren't for Shen Yunchu being able to hear his inner voice, he would have thought he was as cold as he seemed on the surface. Shen Yunchu lowered his eyes, his obedient and gentle expression remaining unchanged. He only dared to refute in his heart. Yes, you are both civil and military, talented and beautiful, but I dare not. You are so kind, please spare me. As she was thinking about it, Bai Yuheng nodded with a smile between her eyebrows and eyes. She seemed to have a good impression of Shen Yunchu, and she responded with a single word, of course it's convenient. As the saying goes, 1,000 pieces of gold are easy to obtain, but a confidant is hard to find. If Miss Shen genuinely likes it, she can come back to this palace and have someone personally deliver it to the general's mansion. Upon hearing this, Shen Yunchu hurriedly said, "How dare you trouble the princess again? I'll send someone to the princess's mansion to pick it up later. I'll thank the princess first." Bai Yuheng replied with a smile, "Miss Shen, you're welcome." After speaking, her tone paused slightly, and then she tentatively said, "Miss Shen is interested in military strategy, but does she have any research on cavalry and archery?" As the words fell, the voice of a certain crown prince rang out before Shen Yunchu could answer, "My family's crispy hands cannot be lifted or carried, of course not. What if they bump into each other? What are you asking, stinky woman?" Shen Yunchu's heart was filled with dissatisfaction. "When did I become part of your family? Can you be more shameless?" However, there was still a smile on his face. The princess laughed. "I am still young and have been weak since childhood. Although my family is a martial arts general, they are concerned about my health and my parents do not allow me to practice martial arts." This is not something she made up. I heard that when she was around 5 or 6 years old, she had a serious illness, and she didn't remember it herself. It was all told by Grandma Shi from the mansion. At that time, Shen Jichang spent a lot of money hiring the best divine doctor from Chuanxingen to treat her, which saved her life. However, since then, her body has become increasingly weak, and it has been only in recent years that she has slightly recovered. So on weekdays, she can't do many things, so she prefers to be quiet and doesn't want to participate. It's also good to read books when she's free. After Shen Yunchu finished speaking, Bai Yuheng's hesitant gaze wandered over her. A hint of interest clearly flashed in her eyes, but it gave Shen Yunchu a hint of a bad feeling in his heart. Everyone knows that Princess Yulan has a free-spirited and playful nature. She wouldn't be, "Then I'll teach you." Sure enough, as expected by Shen Yunchu, Bai Yuheng blinked at her, looking excited and anxious as if she had found something to do. Shen Yunchu had made a mistake and was about to refuse, but Bai Yuheng had already stood up and turned towards Emperor Shingen from her position. It seemed that she had gone to resign. "What should we do? Now it's a bit difficult to get off." At the right moment, the damn voice echoed in her ear again, "Hurry up and beg my king. Can't you see such a big living person like me? As long as you speak, not to mention Bai Yuheng, even the heavenly king Laozi can't take you away from my king." This Shen Yunchu furrowed his brows slightly, feeling that one head was twice as big. Before she could react, Bai Yuheng had already turned back. She stood in the same spot and smiled at Shen Yunchu, "Let's go. Father has already agreed, nothing else is possible. In terms of horseback archery, this palace has not lost to anyone." Shen Yunchu politely stood up and saw her tone pause slightly. Her gaze was both proud and playful, and she cast a disdainful glance at Bai Yuheng beside her. "Of course, except for this kid," he said. Shen Yunchu carefully raised his eyes to look at Bai Yuheng beside him. He saw a slight frown on his brow, and a hint of murderous aura could be seen between his eyebrows. He had been playing with the jade cup in his hand from beginning to end, but he never glanced at Shen Yunchu. Without waiting for Shen Yunchu to say anything more, Bai Yuheng had already dragged Shen Yunchu away. It wasn't until their figures disappeared into the hall that Bai Yuheng slowly and heavily tapped the jade cup in his hand onto the table. In the blink of an eye, he glanced at Emperor Shingen and Shen Jichang sitting on the table chatting about Sheng Huan. When Bai Yuheng had a good time playing, the palace banquet had already ended. However, it was said that Emperor Shingen was overjoyed and invited Shen Jichang to the imperial study to chat about his daily life. She stayed for a while longer. When Shen Yunchu received the news of leaving the palace, it was already 5 o'clock in the morning. He bid farewell to Bai Yuheng and walked along the palace path towards the direction of the palace gate, revealing himself even deeper. There were not many people along the way, except for the guiding lady holding a lamp to serve on both sides. There was silence all around, and the surrounding palaces were all idle. The two of them were walking on the road, and a faint echo could be heard. Suddenly, there was a commotion coming from the corner ahead, which sounded like whispers from people. Shen Yunchu lowered his head and paused in his footsteps, feeling a sense of unease in his heart. However, when he looked up, it was already too late. The grandmother had already led her around the corner, and she saw several figures standing in the courtyard. The lights were dark and a tall figure stood in front of the water tank, blocking her view. She could only see the person firmly grasping something and pressing it into the water. The sound of splashing gradually weakened from the initial intensity until she no longer struggled. In just a few seconds, Shen Yunchu's already sleepy mind suddenly woke up and quickly reacted. She turned her head to look at the old lady beside her. The old lady stared, obviously also frightened by this scene. She opened her mouth, trying to stop the other party. Shen Yunchu was so scared that she grabbed her sleeve, but couldn't stop her from pulling up the decibel. "Who are you?" Shen Yunchu's pupils froze for a moment, and after a brief hesitation, she didn't care about anything else. She turned her head and prepared to go back, but it wasn't as fast as the other person. Before Shen Yunchu could take a few steps, she was stopped by someone falling from the sky. She paused again, instinctively turning her head, only to hear the sound of a sharp blade unsheathed, a sword shadow flashing past, and with a poop sound, accompanied by a scream, blood splattered, and the old woman fell to the ground in response. The lantern in her hand fell to the ground and burned instantly. With a brief light, Shen Yunchu saw the lifeless corpse under her feet. She gritted her teeth, covered her mouth with her hand, and almost screamed. In terror, she quickly retreated and leaned her back against the wall before reluctantly stopping. Before she could react, a big palm savagely grabbed her arm, causing her to stumble and almost drag her into the yard, throwing her to the ground. Immediately after, a strong voice came from behind. "Your Highness, it's a little child." Shen Yunchu had not yet recovered from the recent fright, nor dared he look up at the person in front of him. All he could see was a pair of black boots, and the bright yellow hem was quite eye-catching. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice from her heart. How could it be her? These useless people really have no vision. When they should throw it at me, they insist on throwing it on the ground. It must hurt so much in this one fall. For some reason, listening to his untimely voice, Shen Yunchu suddenly became less afraid. She suppressed her trembling body, and her gaze moved up inch by inch. The last thing that caught her eye was indeed Bai Yuheng's face, which remained gloomy and indifferent for eternity. She knelt at his feet, looked up at him, but her gaze was unconsciously drawn to the colorful veil revealing the corner of the water tank behind him, and her feet, weakly resting on the edge of the tank, her entire upper body had already sunk into it. Although the person inside the water tank couldn't be seen, Shen Yunchu knew this pair of shoes. They were a pair of flower shoes inlaid with many pearls and gemstones, embroidered with bright red peonies. The owner of the shoes is the queen's niece, Wei Chang'e. Shen Yunchu remembers it because she once showed off the shoes at the banquet of the sisters of the aristocratic family. According to her, the queen ordered people to customize them for her, which is the only pair in the world. Shen Yunchu's gaze skipped and he quickly lowered his gaze, forcing himself to remain calm. He opened his mouth and said, "See you, Your Highness the Crown Prince." He didn't speak, and Shen Yunchu only heard his inner voice. My voice trembled. It seems that I was scared quite a bit. What should I do? Why did it happen to be her? Killing her and silencing her made me reluctant. But if I don't kill her, she has always had a good relationship with the Empress. What if she goes to report it? End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Look at my daughter. In law, she's scared. You are listening at novel full.audio. Chapter 4. Look at my daughter. In law, she's scared. Shen Yunchu knelt on the ground, swallowed nervously, and the guard who had just pulled her up stood aside, silently pulling out the sword from his waist. Shen Yunchu's heart tightened and he immediately heard Bai Yuheng's inner voice. Ha! So conflicted. This Pang Yong, I haven't even given an order yet. What knife should I draw? Look at my daughter. In law, who's scared? So is Su, and I don't know how to say a word. Whenever I argue that you haven't seen anything, I can let you go. Why didn't I say anything? When should I kneel down? At this moment, Shen Yunchu suddenly didn't know whether she should be afraid or have some other reaction. This kind of thing was really beyond common sense, making it difficult for her to distinguish which was the real Bai Yuheng. As Shen Yunchu watched the knife gradually approaching him, his spirit flashed and he hurriedly said, "I didn't know that your Highness the Crown Prince was here to admire the moon. I didn't mean to disturb you. My father has been waiting at the palace gate for a long time. If I can't wait, I'm afraid I will be anxious. Please forgive me for disturbing you." As she spoke, she knocked her head to the ground with a loud bang, and the sword in the guard's hand gave a slight pause. She had never seen such a quick-witted little girl before. If she were to be killed now, Shen Jichang would not be able to arouse suspicion, which would be troublesome. While pondering, his eyes looked at Bai Yuheng with some surprise or hesitation. Bai Yuheng stood in front of Shen Yunchu, with his hands behind his back, his face full of malice. He raised his hand and pinched Shen Yunchu's chin, forcing her to lift her head. The fierce expression on his face was not weak, and he thought to himself, "My wife is really smart." His words were, "How can you guarantee that you really only saw the moon tonight?" In response to his cold eyes, Shen Yunchu was totally lost for a moment. She swallowed saliva and forced herself to calm down. "Tonight, my daughter was taught riding and shooting by the eldest Royal Highness Princess, and she never left the side hall. My father sent someone to summon her. Kai left alone. The moonlight was shining all the way, and the guards kept patrolling, without meeting anything else." As she spoke, tears of terror flowed uncontrollably from the corners of her eyes. Bai Yuheng's eyes dimmed slightly, and his expression remained unchanged. However, Shen Yunchu could clearly hear his inner voice. "Oh, don't cry. When you cry, I really can't take action. I won't be able to kill you for now." Bai Yuheng pinched her chin and looked at her with a deep and eerie gaze for a long time, but did not see the killing intent in his eyes fade away. In the long wait, Shen Yunchu shed tears, but dared not speak out. The pleading intent in his eyes seemed to overflow along with the tears, and I still felt pity when I saw it. It was difficult for people not to feel sympathy. Bai Yuheng's heart softened and he said, all right. If you are willing to honestly keep this secret, I won't blame you. How could you be so scared? I really feel heartbroken." He gently released her chin, losing support, and Shen Yunchu fell to the ground, trembling uncontrollably. However, his words remained cold. "Miss San is very clever, so please remember what you said earlier. If the King of Japan hears any unfavorable news, it may affect Mr. Shen and Mrs. Shen," he said. "Pang Yong, if you personally escort Miss San out of the palace, be sure to watch her leave with your own eyes." Pang Yong sheathed the knife in his hand, arched his hand and took orders. "I obey." He immediately reached out and grabbed Shen Yunchu's arm, lifting her from the ground and pulling her towards the direction of the palace gate. The passage leading to the palace gate after leaving the palace was left by Shen Yunchu alone, while Pang Yong hid in the dark and watched her leave. Outside the palace gate, Shen Jichang had been waiting for a long time. When he saw Shen Yunchu coming out, he greeted him with relief and said, "Girl, why is it so late? Is something delayed?" Shen Yunchu stood in the same place, staring blankly at Shen Jichang. Along the way, the scene that had just happened kept flashing in his mind, including the old lady who couldn't close her eyes and the pair of shoes adorned with gemstones and pearls. She opened her mouth and didn't say anything before her eyes turned black and she fainted to death. When Shen Yunchu regained consciousness, she was already inside the general's mansion. She opened her eyes and looked at the familiar top of the bed. Last night's incident seemed like a dream. But her palm was wrapped in gauze, which should have been the hand that was scratched when she fell to the ground last night. It was a real reminder to her that it was not a dream. Mississippi. Perhaps seeing her open her eyes, the maid guarding beside her tentatively called out, and Shen Yunchu finally regained his senses. This maid, who is almost the same age as her, is called Lin Lang, a close maid who has been following her since childhood. Shen Yunchu slowly turned his head and glanced around. The familiar environment made her feel at ease. She struggled to get up, and Lin Lang quickly stepped forward to put on a soft pillow. He carefully covered her with a blanket and brought a cup of hot water. Looking at the cup that Lin Lang had stuffed into her hand, she felt a bit dazed for an instant. She looked up at the window and the sunlight was just right. She turned her head to look at Lin Lang and said, "When is it now?" Lin Lang replied, "It's almost noon, miss." "It's already so late." Shen Yunchu breathed a long sigh of relief, and Lin Lang saw that her face was not good. With a worried expression, he asked, "Miss, what exactly happened to you?" "According to the master, you fainted before you spoke from the palace." Listening to Lin Lang's words, the warning words from Bai Yuheng flashed through Shen Yunchu's mind. She silently clenched the cup in her hand, her heart slightly confused, and her face forced to remain calm. She replied, "It's nothing, it's just that it's difficult to walk in the dark. I accidentally fell." Looking at the pale face of her own master, Lin Lang didn't ask much. She had been following Shen Yunchu since childhood and knew that Shen Yunchu was afraid of the dark, and the path to the palace was complex and intricate. Her vision was not good at night, and it was normal for her to fall. Suddenly, Shen Yunchu thought of something again. She turned her head and looked at Lin Lang. "Where's my dad?" "Miss, feel relieved. The master is narrating with the Prime Minister in the study," Lin Lang said. "The master said that the school has already taken a leave with the master. You can rest at home and rest for a few days before going." Shen Yunchu nodded thoughtfully, feeling relieved to learn that his father was safe and sound. He then remembered and took a sip of water to suppress his shock. By the time Shen Yunchu went to the school as usual to attend classes with other sisters from prestigious families, it had already been almost half a month. In addition, she had slipped and fallen into the water a few months ago, and had rested for another month. In total, it had been delayed by almost 2 months. In the noisy classroom, before the teacher arrived, a group of young sisters around the same age were talking and laughing, and occasionally there were some shy or cheerful laughter. Everyone is an independent desk, with different and untreated flowers and plants placed on it, which will be used in flower arrangement classes later. Shen Yunchu sat alone at his desk, somewhat absent-minded, sorting out the things on the table. Suddenly, a girl's deliberately lowered voice came from behind, "If you ask me, that Wei Chang is really a wicked person." Upon hearing the sound, Shen Yunchu's hand suddenly paused and his heart tightened. The girl's voice paused slightly before continuing, "I drowned in the water tank for no reason." "How deep is that tank?" "It's only when I stand up that I reach my waist." The crowd sighed for a moment, so timid that they could only cover their ears and plead softly, "Oh no, you stop talking. You're so good. Why did you mention this? I'm afraid I'll have another nightmare tonight." "You're so cowardly," someone joked. In the laughter of several young girls, the topic was skipped. Shen Yunchu's tense heartstrings gradually relaxed, and suddenly, someone behind him called out, "Crispy." Shen Yunchu's body was startled like a startled bird, and when he turned around, his slightly panicked expression met the person's puzzled gaze. "She is the daughter of Pei Shangshu, Pei Shuyan." The two of them met in 4 eyes. Pei Shuyan originally wanted to say something to her, but it was evident that she was like this. She then hesitated and asked, "What's wrong with you? Your complexion is so bad." End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Lottery Assessment. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Lottery Assessment. Amidst the same puzzled gaze of several people, Shen Yunchu forced out a smile and shook his head pretending to be relaxed. "It's okay, maybe he didn't sleep well last night, right?" She stopped talking and turned her head to continue playing with the flowers and plants on the table. The few of them looked at each other. Shen Yunchu had always been used to being alone, with a cold and slow temperament. They had long been accustomed to it and didn't take it to heart. She turned her head and continued to laugh, only Bai Yuheng looked at Shen Yunchu's back thoughtfully. As if thinking of something, she left the group behind and moved to Shen Yunchu's side. I heard that at the palace banquet that night, you only came out of the palace very late. Have you seen anyone who seems to be the murderer? Shen Yunchu's movements paused again and again, and Bai Yuheng was interested in everything, especially this kind of eerie and frightening, supernatural event. Shen Yunchu felt a chill in his heart and forced himself to remain calm. When I came out that night, it was indeed very late, but apart from the palace guards, I didn't meet anyone else. I was already a bit scared after falling, so don't scare me. Seeing a hint of unease on her face, Bai Yuheng sneered, okay, I'm teasing you. Why are you so nervous? At this time, Sisters' teasing came from behind. Look what you said, if Susu saw the murderer, would he still be here safe and sound? I'm afraid that he would have been the ghost of the murderer. Immediately, a burst of bright laughter came from behind. Shen Yunchu lowered his eyes and reluctantly tugged at the corner of his mouth, holding a flower branch in his hand, feeling lingering fear and unable to laugh. I heard that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince is coming to inspect the school today. Do you think he will come to the women's residence? The conversation changed slightly as they discussed the inspection. Bai Yuheng picked up a plum blossom from the table and knocked it on the girl's head. The girl turned around dissatisfied and gave her a glare. She then heard Bai Yuheng jokingly say, "Why? You miss spring. His Highness the Crown Prince is coming, so he is also going to the men's quarters. The girls' quarters have always been inspected by the Princess Chang. What are you thinking?" The girl let out a dissatisfied snort, pursed her lips, and in the midst of everyone's laughter, she pouted and played with the flowers and plants on the table with a slightly shy expression. This academy was run by He Taifu, the teacher of Emperor Shingen, and houses the children of officials and the royal family. It is divided into a male dormitory and a female dormitory, each with different education. The male dormitory focuses on military tactics, horseback riding and archery, and martial arts, while the female dormitory focuses on embroidery, flower arrangement, and tea tasting. Originally, it was Grand Tutor He who personally led people to inspect the achievements of various students. Later, as Grand Tutor He grew older and had constant mobility, this task fell on Crown Prince Bai Yuheng and Princess Bai Yuheng. Shen Yunchu frowned slightly and turned to look at Bai Yuheng. "Your Highness, will you come to inspect?" "When did it happen?" "Yesterday," Bai Yuheng said. "Yes, you didn't come yesterday, so you didn't know." What Master Chen said after school yesterday was strange to say. He originally said he should have come the day before yesterday, but there was something that delayed him, so he changed it to today. Is that right? Shen Yunchu smiled thoughtfully, but didn't say much. Recalling yesterday morning when she was chatting with her mother in the hospital, people from the university came over. Although it was said to be visiting Shen Yunchu's illness, the words were all meant to inquire. Sure enough, the people from the academy left the general's mansion at noon, and the news of the afternoon inspection arrived at the academy. She returned to school today, and Bai Yuheng's inspection was also chosen today. How could there be such a coincidence? Shen Yunchu felt a hint of unease in his heart, but outside the classroom, there was a sound of footsteps, and noise came from all around. Hurry up, the master is here." As he spoke, the girls hurriedly pushed back to their positions. The next moment, a middle-aged woman walked into the classroom from outside. She was Professor Shen Yunchu and Chen Fuzi, who was arranging flowers and drinking tea with the ladies of the official family. She was dressed in a deep blue long shirt, with a serious expression and a slightly furrowed brow. Wherever she stood, she felt inexplicably oppressive. The hall suddenly fell silent. Master Chen's eyes were indifferent and glanced at the ladies of the family present. According to what he said yesterday, His Royal Highness the Prince and His Royal Highness the Long Princess came to inspect the hall. Now people have come to the hall. Please go with me to the hall. As soon as these words were spoken, except for Shen Yunchu, all the young ladies looked at each other with an indescribable expression of joy and enthusiasm. If we go to the main hall together, does it mean that the Crown Prince is also here? If the people from the male dormitory are there, the Crown Prince must also be there. The excited voices of such discussions were incessant, but Shen Yunchu's heart was becoming increasingly uncertain. She always had a premonition that this Bai Yuheng was coming towards her, otherwise, there would be no such coincidence. Is it because of the matter with Wei Chang'e? The more I thought about Shen Yunchu, the more upset he felt. He followed a group of sisters to the hall and stood at the end of the crowd, trying to reduce his sense of existence. As soon as she stood firm, a familiar voice could be heard in her ear. Where is Su Su? Where is my Su Su? Didn't she say I would come to the school today? Su Su, Su Su. Su Su. Listening to the voice that was not related to his surface coldness and arrogance, Shen Yunchu felt a chill in her heart. The consciousness of her subordinates in front of her was stirred together, and she felt uncomfortable all over. She carefully raised her eyes and glanced at Bai Yuheng sitting on the ground. He was dressed in a bright yellow waist-tied brocade robe, with a golden crown tied around his hair. He was full of energy, noble yet aloof. Bai Yuheng sat side by side with him, dressed in red and with long hair, beautiful yet dignified. Between his eyebrows, there was a hint of rare heroism in women. Master Chen, have you all arrived? Bai Yuheng asked. Chen Fuzi stood at the top and nodded slightly. If you're talking to the princess, the children of the male and female dormitories are all here. Male left and female right, standing in 2 rows each, Shen Yunchu stood at the end of the female dormitory students, calmly hanging his head, frowning slightly, and his eyes indifferent. Suddenly, she heard again, oh, it turns out that in the end, it looks pretty good and the disease should be cured. But why is his face still so bad? Does Shen Jichang really care about his daughter? It's not because he's biased. He's not good at my king's pastry, is it? Let's settle accounts with him later. However, why is Su Su standing so far? Everyone wants to stand first, but how can she stand last with so many people blocking her? How can I see this? If I can't see it, then it's for nothing, isn't it? Shen Yunchu stood at the end of the crowd, in the originally quiet hall, but now she only felt noisy and tired. The events of that night seemed to still be vivid in her mind, and it was strange to think of standing in front of her. Shen Yunchu said, I really appreciate it. During contemplation, Bai Yuheng's voice came from the hall. Junior brothers and sisters, our palace and the Crown Prince have been ordered to come and test the results of your studies. As there was only one assessment a few days ago, after consultation between the palace and the Crown Prince, it was decided to adopt a spot check method, selecting one student from each of the male and female dormitories for individual assessment. For the sake of fairness, everyone will draw lots to decide. Immediately afterwards, the father-in-law who was carrying the prepared documents on the side lined up with a group of young ladies to draw. This kind of thing always brings joy and sorrow, hoping to be drawn because winning means having a chance to spend time alone with the Crown Prince. Seizing this opportunity and making the Crown Prince look at him differently, entering the Eastern Palace is not a problem. I don't hope it, probably because I don't excel in what I have learned. If I don't pass the spot check, not to mention making the Crown Prince look at me differently, I will inevitably be punished. If it's more serious, it may not necessarily affect my family. Being punished for being poorly disciplined is at least a punishment. After all, those who can enter this institution to learn are at least the children of the 4th-rank official family. Their work style and achievements are directly related to the honor and face of the family. In other words, if a child doesn't learn well, parents will also be affected. Those who have confidence in themselves naturally hope to show more, while those who cannot learn well hope not to win. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Miss Ben likes the one in your hand. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. Miss Ben likes the one in your hand. For Shen Yunchu, she belongs to the kind who can learn well but doesn't want to show off. This unlucky crown prince, whoever likes to get involved with him, will get involved. Anyway, she doesn't want to have any relationship with him at all. After the students finished winning the lottery, each with their own thoughts began to check. Some who didn't win breathed a sigh of relief, while others looked unwilling. At this moment, before Shen Yunchu could open it, he suddenly reached out with a hand and quickly removed the sign from her hand, stuffing another one into her hand. As soon as she looked up, she saw the other person lifting her chin at her. Her eyebrows and eyes were picturesque, and she was charming. The large peony flowers on the back of her head were even more charming and bold. Her name is Shen Shuyao, and she is Shen Yunchu's half-sister. She is the second in the family and the second wife of the Shen family. Their relationship is not good, and can even be considered bad. Su is the one between the two, which makes the treatment of sisters different in the mansion. Shen Shuyao is dissatisfied with this and always likes to find fault. But she can't hide her feelings. She seems to be afraid that others will not see it. There are not many daughters in the Shen family, and there are a total of 4 daughters, including 2 young masters, who were adopted by Shen Jichan on behalf of his comrades. Among them, Shen Yunchu and Shen Shuyao have the worst relationship. Whether in her past life or this life, Shen Yunchu had long been accustomed to it. She held the sign in her hand and, as expected, looked contemptuous. "What are you doing?" Shen Shuyao glanced at her and said, "Don't do anything. Miss, I like the one in your hand and think it can be exchanged." Shen Yunchu rolled his eyes and ignored her, but as soon as she opened it, his mind exploded and he almost took a breath and passed out. She stumbled a few steps, but Bai Yuheng, who was standing beside her, helped her up and said, Su, are you okay?" Something big, something big." Shen Yunchu struggled to stabilize his mind and quickly turned his head to look at Shen Shuyao, who was disheartened as he spread out the missed ticket in his hand. Following the gaze of Shen Yunchu, the two of them met in 4 directions. Shen Shuyao looked at her and then at the sign in her hand. From her frightened gaze, Shen Shuyao seemed to have read something, and that was that she had fallen for it. This time, for the first time, the 2 people who had never had the same opinion had the same idea. To switch back. Without waiting for Shen Yunchu to take action, Bai Yuheng leaned over and looked at the beautiful peonies on the paper in her hand. She was surprised and said, "Su, you've been hit." For a moment, Shen Yunchu felt his heart sink to the bottom. The hands they wanted to exchange stopped in mid-air, taking on the different gazes from all over. It wasn't either retracting them or exchanging them. Bai Yuheng held the blank signed paper and patted her shoulder with a smile in her eyes. "Oh no, it's okay. You're so amazing, you'll always be the top scorer in the next assessment. There's definitely no problem," she said. Shen Yunchu and Shen Shuyao were facing each other with 4 eyes. In front of everyone, they could only reluctantly retract their outstretched hand. Shen Shuyao didn't dare to make any other moves, only reluctantly crumpled the signed paper in her hand and threw it to the ground. She let out a cold snort in anger and left through the crowd. Shen Yunchu stood in place, powerless to smile bitterly in the eyes of sympathy, envy, and jealousy from the crowd. For a moment, he didn't know what to say, and could only shout in his heart. "What a pity." Unexpectedly, almost at the same time, she heard a scream from the familiar voice, and then he almost jumped 3 feet high and couldn't conceal his excited voice. "God really helped me. It's crispy, it's crispy." Shen Yunchu was holding the sign in her hand, feeling only the glaring peony red. She looked up at Bai Yuheng, whose expression remained cold. Chen Fuzi stood on the side, unable to hear what they were saying, but could guess that it was mostly about these children's studies. On the surface, his attention seemed to be focused on Chen Fuzi and Bai Yuheng, but in reality, if it weren't for her being able to hear his thoughts, she would have almost believed him. Shen Yunchu wanted to cry without tears, always feeling that he had planned it, but upon closer examination, all these signatures were randomly taken out of order, and no one could guarantee that anyone would win. On the other hand, Bai Yuheng still had a stern face and a demeanor that everyone present owed him money. However, Shen Yunchu felt extremely hopeless and only hoped that he would never seek personal revenge. If he could forget what happened that night, that would be even better. After the draw ended, all the students who missed the exam rushed back to the classroom, leaving only 2 students who were selected for the assessment to give separate lectures. The female dormitory is Shen Yunchu, what about the male dormitory? In thought, Shen Yunchu turned his head and searched for the figure left behind in the crowd that had not yet left. In the end, she set her gaze on the figure that stood tall in the crowd. She remembered that person, the son of Grand Tutor Xing Ongua, Song Yuanqing. He was dressed in green clothes, floating out of the dust. It's not an exaggeration to say that even though he was standing in the crowd, he had a kind of otherworldly cleanliness. He was gentle and elegant like the clear moon and wind, and like the gentle moonlight quietly shining into the mountain stream at night. With just one glance, he could be seen in the crowd. Perhaps Shen Yunchu's gaze was too direct, which made him notice. His gaze slowly moved away from the signed paper in his hand, and he tilted his head to meet her 4 eyes. He only lowered his gaze and smiled, nodding to signal. At this moment, Shen Yunchu's previously anxious heart suddenly calmed down, and she also smiled and nodded in response. Although both family heads were important officials in the court, their interactions were not very close, and the 2 were only acquaintances. Shen Yunchu didn't even remember how Song Yuanqing went on in the previous life. In thought, she turned her head and suddenly met the fierce gaze of a high-altitude prince. In the blink of an eye, her good mood passed in a blink of an eye, and a familiar voice arrived as promised. Okay, I'm young, but I'm not afraid. In front of this king, I'm flirting with other men. Did I die? There was a loud roar, and at this tone, her teeth were about to bite apart. The deafening Shen Yunchu almost covered her ears with her hand. She pretended to be indifferent and moved her eyes, pretending not to look at him. After everyone in the hall left, there were only 2 students who were selected, Bai Yuheng, Bai Wanning, and Chen Fuzi in charge of this meeting. You 2 come forward. Chen Fuzi stood beside Bai Wanning and waved at them. Shen Yunchu lowered his eyes and knelt down with Song Yuanqing in front of the 2 of them. I have seen both your highnesses, he said. Bai Wanning raised her phoenix eyes slightly and glanced at the 2 people kneeling in front of the hall. She only briefly admonished them. I heard what Master Chen said, among the students, you 2 have the most outstanding academic performance. This random inspection is also fate's will, and it is related to the future rise and fall of the school. You 2 must not neglect it. Yes, we will definitely follow the princess's teachings. Bai Wanning nodded in satisfaction and turned her head to look at Bai Yuheng beside her. Bai Yuheng silently looked at Shen Yunchu kneeling on the ground, his eyes as deep as the bottomless waters of the abyss. Shen Yunchu lowered her head, deliberately avoiding his gaze. Suddenly, she heard his doubts clearly in his heart. Strange, why can't you still hear anything? It shouldn't be, it could have been heard before. What did you hear? Now, replacing Shen Yunchu's doubts, the main hall was very quiet, with only Bai Yuheng's clear voice. She dared not look up, but could vaguely feel something was wrong. After a moment of silence, Bai Yuheng seemed to take a long breath of relief. He probably didn't hear what he wanted to hear in his heart, so in this sigh, he couldn't help feeling a bit disappointed. In the blink of an eye, when his gaze fell on Song Yuanqing beside him, his painting style suddenly changed. Shen Yunchu heard his gritted teeth in his heart and said, "You kid, dare you seduce my wife?" He thought so in his heart, but his words were. Prince Song is a talented person, and he will definitely be the pillar of our prosperous and peaceful country in the future. But as the saying goes, a wise man will inevitably make mistakes when he thinks twice, and Prince Song needs to carefully consider. What is the smell of gunpowder all over here? End of this chapter. Chapter 7, At least not too passive. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7, At least not too passive. Shen Yunchu felt a bit helpless, as if something in his mind had been stirred up. Listening to him speak seemed like a compliment, but his tone was full of warning, which left several people who couldn't hear him confused. There was no intersection between the two, and of course, there was no conflict. Song Yuanqing knew that this great Buddha was not easy to provoke, but he also asked himself that he had not offended him. Although he didn't quite understand where Bai Yuheng's inexplicable hostility came from, Song Yuanqing nodded slightly and calmly replied, "Thank you very much for your teachings, Your Highness the Crown Prince. Students should remember it in their hearts." Bai Yuheng looked at him, but the coldness in his eyes did not diminish at all. He had a cold face, and his gaze only fell on Song Yuanqing from beginning to end, without giving Shen Yunchu a single glance. Bai Yuheng remained silent, and no one dared to speak again. The silence in the main hall was somewhat eerie, but Shen Yunchu could clearly hear Bai Yuheng's puzzled voice. "It's really a coincidence. How could you not hear it? It's not right, listen again." He seemed to be holding his breath for a moment, and after a while, Shen Yunchu heard him let out a long sigh. "It seems like you really can't hear it." "No, it's either like it, it's just not audible. Or is it that she didn't think of anything? That's not possible either. According to this girl's broken mouth, at this time, her face is obedient and tight, and she probably has scolded me several times in her heart. I used to only feel noisy, but now I can't hear it anymore. Instead, I'm a bit uncomfortable. It's strange, what's the problem with it? Except for her, it seems that everyone else's is not good either. Is it the wrong way for this king to be reborn?" Thinking about this, he let out a heavy sigh, feeling somewhat lost as his mind became suspicious. Shen Yunchu lowered his head, his face turning red and white, white and red. Feeling physically and mentally exhausted, wanting to cry without tears. "Isn't that right, big brother? Why do you still learn from others to play and be reborn? Not only can you play rebirth, but you can also read your mind. Are you playing this big game? Wait, if that's the case, in the previous life, he knew many things. No wonder when he was with her, he always threw his cup inexplicably. I think he heard what she was thinking. That is to say, including the things that she roast about his incompetence on the wedding night, he should also know. It's not that she wants to remember it herself, but it's truly unforgettable. At that time, she knew about the rumors of Bai Yuheng and Bai Wanning before marrying into the Eastern Palace. Although she dared not complain about the marriage bestowed upon her by the emperor, she still felt somewhat dissatisfied and resentful in her heart. Unable to show it on the surface, couldn't it be satisfying to curse in the heart? So, on his wedding night, he lifted her red hat. At that time, she felt that this old man looked like a dog. He was already 23 years old and didn't have a wife or concubine, so he probably didn't act. At that time, she was only on a whim and had never thought of such a ridiculous thing as reading the heart. She felt relieved and did not delve into it. Who knew that Bai Yuheng would use his strength to prove himself? He was strong and full of blood, and had been bothering her all night. She couldn't bear it anymore. Her throat was hoarse from crying, and she fainted several times before being awakened by him. In the end, he had to beg for mercy, but only in exchange for his words. This is what the crown princess deserves. To be honest, he gave her an unforgettable first night in 2 lifetimes based on his strength. At that time, she didn't think much, only felt that it was Bai Yuheng who was naturally violent and didn't know the right balance. But now it seems that he is just proving himself against it. Shen Yunchu blushed and roasted in his heart. How childish. In fact, it's not surprising that Shen Yunchu thought so. Among the high-ranking officials and nobles in this imperial capital, anyone with some power or family background would marry and take concubines at the age of 16 or 17. Moreover, Bai Yuheng was still the crown prince. Regardless of his power and status, his face was enough to make many wealthy ladies in the imperial capital fall in love with him. However, as far as Shen Yunchu knew, at that time, he did not have a woman by his side. Moreover, this kind of statement was not from her mouth. She had also heard people secretly chat with her, and she remembered it in her heart. Coupled with her young age at the time, what she heard was true, and she did see him not being close to women. How could this not make people think too much? Who knows, they just keep themselves clean. During her contemplation, she carefully and slowly looked up and saw the person sitting in the seat leaning on their position, with one hand supporting their forehead and eyes lightly closed, as if concentrating on feeling. Suddenly, Bai Yuheng's eyes lifted, and Shen Yunchu caught his fierce gaze off guard. At the moment when his gaze met, she felt 4 words quickly and briefly drift through her mind. My life is at rest. In an instant, she was like falling into an ice cave, and the image of him mercilessly pressing Wei Chang'e into the water tank that night immediately came to her mind, until the other party remained motionless. If Bai Yuheng was also reborn, with various past lives, especially when he knew that the Shen family would eventually rebel, he would definitely have targeted the Shen family from the beginning. In this situation, if he knew about Shen Yunchu's rebirth, he would have to kill her first like drowning Wei Chang'e. It's guaranteed that she will be the next Wei Chang'e. In addition to being frightened, she even forgot to move her eyes. In just a few seconds, she had already figured out how to die, almost as Bai Yuheng asked her, "What kind of death do you want?" She knelt on the ground, forced to calm down and hold her breath, but dared not even take a breath. For the first time in so many days, she felt that hearing Bai Yuheng's good intentions was not a bad thing. At least, she's not too passive yet. But just as Shen Yunchu wanted to confirm his thoughts, his inner voice suddenly came to a halt, as if receiving a flash of fear in Shen Yunchu's eyes, his deep gaze slightly darkened. Bai Yuheng frowned in confusion and displeasure. What kind of gaze is this? It's as if I'm going to eat her. Shen Yunchu swallowed his saliva and secretly pinched his thigh, forcing himself to calm down. He then slowly lowered his head and looked away. Immediately, he stared at her for a while. This time, it was very quiet until Bai Yuheng slowly stood up and there was no more sound. He didn't say anything and turned to leave the main hall. Watching his figure disappear from sight with his own eyes, Shen Yunchu breathed a sigh of relief. Then, Bai Yuheng explained a few words and stood up and walked out of the hall. From then on, the solemn atmosphere inside the hall was somewhat relieved. After struggling until the end of his studies, Shen Yunchu felt a bit uneasy all day. The girls around him gradually packed their things and went out, with their own carriages coming to pick them up. When Shen Yunchu walked out of the classroom, she felt a bit dazed. Suddenly, her footsteps paused, and her previously chaotic and scattered mind instantly condensed. It was nothing else, because she saw Bai Yuheng. He hasn't left yet. Bai Yuheng stood on the necessary path for Shen Yunchu to leave, and many passing girls respectfully bowed before leaving, but he didn't even give a glance. I don't know if it was out of fear towards him. Almost the first time they saw him, their eyes met. Shen Yunchu felt as if he was waiting with a goal at the beginning. At that time, his mind was thinking. Take a different path. But absolute rationality still stopped her from doing so. At this point, if she really turned her head and left, Bai Yuheng would definitely become suspicious. Even if she saw it, she would pretend not to see it. If he really came towards her, then if asked afterwards, she wouldn't be able to find a suitable reason to evade and would be easily suspected. As she pondered, she held the book in her hand, her steps heavy and slow. Bai Yuheng stood in place and walked up to him. Shen Yunchu respectfully bowed and said, "I have seen your Highness the Crown Prince." Bai Yuheng's gaze was burning and unfathomable. Seeing that he didn't speak, Shen Yunchu held his breath and wanted to avoid him, praying in his heart that it would end soon. He wished he could escape and leave immediately. Before she could take a step forward, Bai Yuheng suddenly spoke out, "You seem to be very afraid of me, why?" End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Still so dishonest. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Still so dishonest. Shen Yunchu's heart trembled, and his steps stopped once again. He was so nervous that he felt as if his heart was about to jump out of his chest, to the point where he didn't even notice that he was calling himself me, or perhaps she had become accustomed to listening in her past life. She lowered her eyes, concealing the panic in her eyes that she had no time to hide. After briefly organizing her thoughts, she replied, "The royal authority is inviolable. My daughter is in awe, not in fear." Bai Yuheng didn't speak, but his gaze was deep and he said to himself, "It's still so dishonest. Although I hate it in my heart, I have to deny it on my lips. It hasn't changed at all." Previously, after leaving the main hall, recalling the scene he had just seen inside, he always felt that her gaze at him was a bit strange and familiar, and couldn't help but feel a little puzzled in his heart. At this point in time, they had hardly seen or known each other before, so why was she so afraid of him? Is it just because of the matter with Wei Chang'e? Although it seemed reasonable, every time he saw her occasionally flickering gaze, it was too familiar to him. So, he couldn't help but feel that it seemed more than that. His intuition told him that maybe it was not just because of Wei Chang'e, but if it wasn't because of Wei Chang'e, there were other things. Is it because I overlooked something? He wondered in his heart, is it because I overthink, or are you really keeping something from me? At this moment, Shen Yunchu listened to his thoughts and felt inexplicably uneasy. She could only pretend that nothing had happened and wait by the side with her eyes down. Without his words, she dared not act recklessly and could only force herself to remain calm. Her hands, holding the book, unconsciously tightened. In the long wait that lasted for years, both sides remained silent for a long time. Finally, Shen Yunchu couldn't bear his scorching gaze and couldn't help but speak, "If your Highness has nothing else to do, please bid farewell to me. Brother A is still waiting for me outside the school." Bai Yuheng looked at her, his deep eyes darkened a bit, but he didn't refuse. He just furrowed his brow, looked cold, and nodded thoughtfully. Shen Yunchu felt relieved and slightly bowed, carefully bypassing him. As she brushed past him, she heard him complain in his heart, "Hiding from me. After all, it will be my people sooner or later. See how long you can hide." Humph. Shen Yunchu felt helpless and suddenly felt a tingling sensation on her scalp. If she stayed for an extra second, it would make her feel breathless. She didn't even dare to turn back, and her steps involuntarily accelerated. She almost ran out of the school gate with her skirt in hand, not to mention running. If possible, she even wanted to use a flying one. When Shen Yunchu came out late, most of the people in the academy, except for those who were left behind by the master, had already left, including the other two girls from the Shen family. The carriages outside the academy left one after another, leaving only one parked by the roadside. Beside the carriage, the young man was dressed in black clothes, with a black crown and tied hair, sharp contours on his cheeks, soared eyebrows and starry eyes. He was upright and full of righteousness. He is Shen Yunchu's sibling brother, and although they differ by 11 years, it does not affect the relationship between these siblings. Seeing her expression slightly flustered, Shen Zurui seemed to notice something. "What's wrong? Who bullied you?" he said, and a hint of murderous intent flashed in his eyes, perhaps not even noticing it himself. Standing in front of Shen Zurui, Shen Yunchu hesitated to speak. He looked back at the open gate of the university and remembered the rebellion of the Shen family in his past life. At this critical moment, Bai Yuheng would definitely keep an eye on the Shen family, especially Shen Zurui, so it was better not to let them meet. In thought, Shen Yunchu shook his head and helped Lin Lang onto the carriage. Shen Zurui looked back at the academy with some confusion. Before he could react, Shen Yunchu's voice came from inside the carriage. Brother, let's go back. I'm hungry. Shen Yunchu frowned, his doubt still lingering in his eyes. He turned his head thoughtfully and lightly replied, okay. As he spoke, he got on the carriage, waved the reins in his hand, and let out a soft drink. The carriage slowly drove away from the school, and inside the carriage, Shen Yunchu finally relaxed the tense string. Shen Yunchu's carriage had just driven out not far, and Bai Yuheng and Pang Yong walked out of the academy, only able to see the rear of the carriage from a distance. Has Shen Yunchu returned? Bai Yuheng's eyes dimmed as he turned to look at Pang Yong beside him. When did it happen? Pang Yong pondered for a moment and truthfully replied, I think he just returned a few days ago. I heard that the border battle was a great victory, and the Confucian general specially approved his return for a while to accompany his family. Speaking of Shen Yunchu, he can also be considered a young genius who has caused a sensation in the entire imperial capital. At the age of 5, he practiced martial arts, at the age of 7, he became a disciple of the war god Rufu, and at the age of 10, almost all of the disciples under the Rufu were not his opponents. He has always been the proudest disciple under the Rufu family, and even the elders of the two families are often very dominant. Whether it is Shen Jichang or Rufu, they are always strong-willed. Whenever they seize the opportunity, they always want to provoke each other, but when it comes to Shen Yunchu's matter, Rufu always chooses to bow down first. Later, when the border war was urgent, Emperor Sheng'an ordered Rufu to lead troops to support him. At that time, when Shen Yunchu was 16 years old, Rufu personally brought gifts to the door and wanted to take Shen Yunchu to the border. This gave Shen Jichang a chance. Despite sacrificing him for 3 days, he decided to let him take the person away in the end. From then on, regardless of the size of the war, Rufu took him by his side. In fact, they don't necessarily have any deep hatred, they just heard that they have been biting each other hard since childhood. At that time, they were young and energetic, and they would fight if they didn't agree. Even when they worked together later, they couldn't get rid of this mutual dislike. To be honest, he is still a Confucian scholar who cherishes his talents. He couldn't bear to part with Shen Yunchu, a good young talent. Among the many disciples of aristocratic families in the academy, he fell in love with Shen Yunchu at a glance. Even if he later found out that he was Shen Jichang's son, he didn't give up on it. As he watched the car slowly recede from the rear, Bai Yuheng calmly withdrew his gaze and said, send someone to keep an eye on him, but don't startle the snake. Yes, Pang Yong nodded and took his command, quickly disappearing from sight. Bai Yuheng turned his head and got on the carriage that had just been pulled to the side. He remembered that in the previous life, the Shen family rebelled. According to the scout's report, the rebel leader was not Shen Jichang, but Shen Yunchu. At that time, it was Shen Yunchu who sent a message to Su Su and asked him to leave the East Palace at night. In a sense, it seemed that as long as Shen Yunchu died, none of this would happen in the future. In thought, inside the slightly swaying carriage, Bai Yuheng's murderous intent flashed through his eyes, but now he couldn't take action. His goal was not just to stop the rebellion General Shen's mansion. Shen Yunchu got off the carriage and had just stepped into the mansion door. Before entering the hall, he heard a commotion coming from inside. Upon closer inspection, there was still a faint sound of sobbing. The siblings stood on the corridor, looking at each other, not quite understanding what had happened. At this moment, the butler Li, who was waiting outside the hall, saw the two of them coming back and quickly bent his back. He ran over and said, young master, third miss, you have come back. Go and take a look. The old master's head is almost crying from 2nd Mississippi. Shen Yunchu frowned and said, well behaved, why are you crying? Uncle Li stood on the side, hesitating to speak, his eyes flickering toward Shen Yunchu. Shen Yunchu didn't understand, but Shen Yunchu could guess one or two. Following Uncle Li into the hall, Shen Jichang sat in the main seat with deep furrowed brows and a face covered in haze. The woman who was helping him hold down her temple was dressed in a clear purple long dress, with long hair tied in a bun at the back of her head, noble and dignified. There was a hint of indifference between her eyebrows and eyes, yet still a touch of tenderness. She was Shen Yunchu's birth mother, the head of the general's mansion, and Bai Yuheng. Shen Yunchu glanced at the whole room. In addition to them, there were also 2 aunts in the Shen family, including Shen Yunchu, the eldest daughter of the Shen family, who was always cold and never connected with other sisters in the house. Even the youngest Shen Xiaohun was there. The 5-year-old boy, who looked exactly like him, didn't understand what was happening and snuggled up obediently in the arms of the second wife. End of this chapter. I am the one who went to see His Highness the Crown Prince in Chapter 9. You are listening at novelfull.audio. I am the one who went to see His Highness the Crown Prince in Chapter 9. Shen Shuyao lay on the lap of San Yangzi, crying with a heart-wrenching pain. The entire hall was extremely quiet, except for her sudden crying. Those who didn't know thought it was something big that was about to collapse. Shen Yunchu and Shen Zirui stood still in the hall, saluted, and before Shen Yunchu could inquire about the reason, Shen Shuyao, who was crying bitterly, lifted her head from the legs of the second wife, cried and complained, "Dad, you must be the master of Jingjing, and never favor the third sister just because of the difference between the legitimate and the illegitimate." When she said these words, tears still hung on her face, her eyes and nose were red, especially the thick grievances in her eyes. It was as if everyone present owed her a look, and it was truly a vivid interpretation of the 4 words, "pear blossoms with rain." Shen Yunchu gave her an indifferent glance, knowing without asking why Shen Shuyao was going crazy. She had always been like this. Whenever she was unhappy, dissatisfied, or didn't get what she wanted, she would come to Shen Jichang and make trouble. After all, she could only talk about the legitimate-illegitimate affairs. If Shen Jichang didn't follow her thoughts, she would accuse him of favoring Shen Yunchu, the legitimate daughter, and singing along with the 3 women, hoping to make the entire Shen family restless. Shen Jichang frowned and remained silent. Seeing this, the third lady began to defend her own daughter. "Master, Miss Second is right. You can't ignore the matter of signing the paper. At least you have to make the decision for Miss Third of our family. For Shen Shuyao, this can be considered a once-in-a lifetime opportunity. If she can gain the appreciation of the princess or crown prince in the assessment, will she still worry about her future path?" Shen Yunchu's expression was calm, as he had anticipated. "Dad, the matter of signing the paper was something that second sister insisted on exchanging with me. She forcibly snatched it from me." Upon hearing these words, Shen Shuyao became anxious. She suddenly stood up from her position, her eyes red, and pointed at Shen Yunchu, saying, "That's because you snatched the spot that already belonged to me. It should have been me who went to assess, and it was also me who went to see the crown prince." When it comes to excitement, she even wanted to pounce and fight Shen Yunchu, so Shen Zirui stopped her from the side. Suddenly, there was a panic on the scene, and Shen Yunchu stood in place, still just giving her an indifferent glance. "That's enough." Shen Jichang in the hall scolded angrily, then slapped the table and shook the nearby tea bowl. The scene suddenly fell silent, still afraid of Shen Jichang. Shen Shuyao stood still, suppressing her crying and looking up at Shen Jichang with disbelief, her eyes full of grievances. She turned around, her stubborn and fierce eyes scanning the people around her. With a grit of her teeth, she pushed Shen Zirui away from her and shouted, "Okay. You all favor her. It's all my fault, right?" After speaking, she burst out crying, and the third lady's face changed slightly. She looked like something was not going well, and chased after her with "second miss" in her mouth. Shen Jichang was so angry that his angry words got stuck in his throat. Before he could utter the word, "come back," a sharp throbbing pain came from his chest. His face changed and he covered his chest, coughing fiercely. Bai Yuheng helped him keep his breath flowing, and Shen Yunchu obediently poured a cup of tea and handed it to him, his eyes full of worry. After a while, Shen Jichang finally regained his composure. His face turned red, and the bulging veins on his forehead made him look extremely angry. Since a few years ago, he almost lost his life and was seriously injured when he led his troops to battle. Although he was fortunate enough to save his life, his body and bones have been deteriorating day by day. The Shen family has been loyal and virtuous for generations, and all ancestors have served the Emperor Shengyan. The Shen family has contributed to half of Shengyan's territory, and he does not want the Shen family to withdraw from the court. He also knows that he cannot provide the best education to Shenzurui. So, upon learning that Ru Fu intended to recruit Shenzurui as a beginner, he naturally felt happy in his heart. Shen Yunchu knelt down in front of him, holding the teacup in his hand. Shen Jichang frowned and took a sip before taking a long sigh of relief. It's really becoming more and more unruly. Being spoiled and domineering. There's no such thing as a lady from a wealthy family. When he reached the point of excitement, he couldn't stop coughing. Bai Yuheng helped him calm down and comforted him softly. She's still young, so it's inevitable that she's a bit childish and won't give up. When she gets older, she won't be like this anymore. It's okay if Bai Yuheng doesn't mention it, but when Shen Jichang spoke about it, he became even more dissatisfied. Xiao. Su Su is still 3 years younger than her, why don't you see Su Su indulging? Zhen Zhen is not much older than her, why don't you see Zhen indulging? How can she be indulged? Big ones can't compare, small ones are not as good. He spoke, his chest heaving violently, as if he was about to pass out his anger alive. Bai Yuheng also had no words, only stroking his chest step by step to help him calm down. Shen Yunchu turned his gaze and glanced at Shen Qingyue and Nyangzi, who were standing next to them, with their eyes drooping and never looking at each other from beginning to end. He thought that the mother and son had been brought in to join the fun. Shen Yunchu turned his head and lowered his gaze, not daring to speak up. When it came to this matter, it was indeed because of her. At this point, no matter what she said, it didn't seem quite right, so he decided not to say it. After a long silence, Shen Jichang finally calmed down. He lowered his eyes and looked at Shen Yunchu beside him. What's going on? Shen Yunchu dared not conceal the truth and truthfully recounted the story, from Shen Shuyao forcibly changing the signature paper to Pei Shuyan announcing the two of them wanting to change it back. Shen Jichang listened and his face became increasingly gloomy, only feeling a severe headache. Among these children, Shen Shuyao was the one who didn't let him worry the most. He didn't learn much during the day, but instead, he was cured of bad hair and illness. If we really investigate this, the third lady cannot be separated from her relationship. The third wife of the Shen family, named Liang Miaoyu, was Shen Shuyao's biological mother. She was originally a palace maid serving the Empress Dowager in the palace and was very favored by the Empress Dowager. During a palace banquet, Shen Jichang got drunk and climbed onto his bed while resting in the side hall. Shen Jichang is a person with a bit of a temper, but he is honest and straightforward. He has never had any ulterior motives, and he also values his face. He can't resist the other person crying, making a scene, and hanging himself. He has an attitude that everyone knows about. In the end, the emperor came forward, and the Empress Dowager made the decision by promising the person to Shen Jichang. Therefore, even if Liang Miaoyu had the ability to seduce men, Shen Jichang had already seen through her and never liked her. He only gave her a place to rest in the face of Emperor Shengyan and the Empress Dowager. After a long silence, Shen Jichang said, "It's really her fault. It's about the face of the Shen family, and this matter is not a child's play. Since you have met the crown prince, there is no reason to change people again. Don't pay attention to her. Stealing a chicken won't erode the rice. Instead, blame others. You must not be influenced by her. The assessment must be taken seriously. Daughter knows." Shen Yunchu nodded and agreed. She took the empty teacup handed by Shen Jichang and set it aside, but did not immediately leave. Instead, she obediently knelt at his knee. As soon as she did this, Shen Yichang knew that the little doll had something to ask for. Either she was interested in that book or something from her daughter's family, but compared to Shen Shuyao, she doesn't know the drama of crying, making a scene, or hanging herself. Even if Shen Yichang really doesn't give it, she will only feel frustrated for a while. The elders in the family, regardless of their temperament, prefer to be obedient, let alone someone like Shen Yunchu, who is soft-tempered, spoiled, and has been in poor health since childhood. Against the backdrop of Shen Shuyao, she appears even more petite and lovable. Shen Yichang looked at her and his mood suddenly improved a lot. Shen Yunchu leaned on his lap and said softly, "Dad, there are no classes at tomorrow's school. I want to go to Fanshan with my sisters to see the peach blossoms. Pei and the others are all going, and I also want to go. Just in the beginning of spring, the weather is not very warm yet, but the scenery is beautiful. It is when the flowers are about to bloom, and the area is full of vitality. Many young ladies and gentlemen from prestigious families like to take advantage of this season to go out and play." End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Let's see you tomorrow. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Let's see you tomorrow. Actually, Shen Yunchu didn't really like it, but she knew that Song Yuanqing would also go tomorrow. Instead of letting others control her future fate, it was better for her to choose a husband herself. As long as she can get engaged to the Song family before her marriage, she can no longer be controlled by Bai Yuheng. In the previous life, although the two did not intersect much, in Shen Yunchu's impression, he was completely different from Bai Yuheng. Song Yuanqing has always been gentle and refined, well read in poetry and books, and has been known as a model of aristocratic young masters. She believes that they are suitable. Tomorrow, Song Yuanqing will travel to Fanshan with Song's parents and daughter. For her, this is inevitably an opportunity, and it is better to cultivate relationships from a young age. Shen Yichang looked at her with some concern on his face, thinking that her body had always been poor and she couldn't bear any cold or heat. He opened his mouth and was about to refuse. Before he could say anything he refused, Shen Yunchu shook his legs and grabbed his clothes with both hands. Okay, Dad, you agreed. Let the sisters go too. It's been a long time since we last left, and we're almost suffocating. Is it okay? Please. Shen Yichang's head was a bit dizzy from being disturbed by him, but he was not angry. Although he frowned on his face, the corners of his eyes were full of a smile, and he said, all right, I'll take care of you. It's unreasonable to make such a noise. He pretended to blame, but his face was full of enjoyment. He even raised his hand and lightly tapped Shen Yunchu's nose, spoiling him to the extreme. It must be said that among the few children, Shen Yunchu was the most beloved by Shen Yichang. Not only because she is a legitimate heir, but also because of her delicate and smooth personality. She was a little clever from a young age and is much smarter than the other two daughters. Upon seeing him respond, Shen Yunchu immediately smiled and leaned affectionately against his arm, holding Shen Yichang's hand. Dad, you're so kind. At this moment, the old father's heart was melting, and he couldn't close his mouth. Only then did the haze stimulated by Shen Shuyao sweep away. Suddenly, Shen Yichang's eyes lit up and his gaze fell on Shen Yunchu standing beside him. His gaze paused and he felt a little sad. Tomorrow, Yunchu should also go with you, saving you from tinkering with knives and guns in the courtyard all day. What does it look like to be a girl in a family? Between his words, he seemed to have a hint of anger, and Shen Yunchu gradually withdrew his smile from his face. He stood up and turned his head to look at Shen Yunchu standing next to the second lady. I remember in my previous life, in Shen Yunchu's impression, the relationship between Shen Yunchu and Shen Yichang was not very good. This older sister was not very smart, but fortunately, she was hardworking and did not like female celebrities, preferring swords and spears. However, Shen Yichang did not allow it. Although she did not like it, she still followed Shen Yichang's expectations, restrained her original intention, and studied the female celebrity in detail. Under the constant selection of Shen Jichang, Shen Yunchu married into the Shangshu mansion. However, due to the fact that her first child was not a boy, she was ultimately neglected and fell out of favor. Soon after, news came from the Shangshu mansion that she was suffering from a stubborn illness and passed away in depression. When Shen Yunchu died, she was only 20 years old. At that time, Shen Yunchu had just reached her hairpin and had just set a marriage date with the crown prince. Later on, it was discovered that Shen Yunchu's death was not an accident at all, but rather that the dignified young master of the Shangshu favored his concubine and allowed those concubines to force Shen Yunchu to death. Shen Yunchu didn't want to cause trouble for her family. She always reported good news but not bad news, which ultimately led to tragedy. Shen Jichang was a hot-tempered person. After learning about this, he immediately brought a knife to his door and went to seek justice for his daughter. He almost chopped off the head of the Shangshu young master, but the Shangshu family had someone report to the emperor in the palace, and the emperor sent someone to stop him. The young master of the Shangshu retired from his concubine and renamed Shen Yunchu, building a tomb. However, in the end, Shen Jichang broke his leg and saved his life. Speaking of which, it can be considered a tough fate. Shen Yunchu has a cold and honest personality, not as fierce as Shen Shuyao, nor as smooth as Shen Yunchu. She is not very close to the people in the mansion. In contrast, Shen Yunchu felt that he seemed to be a little luckier than her. At least in the previous life, Bai Yuheng's external methods were cruel and terrifying, but at least he had never treated her harshly. Looking at the person in front of her, Shen Yunchu felt both familiar and unfamiliar. She knew that the person in front of her was her sister, but whether it was in this life or the previous life, they did not have much intersection, and it can even be said that they only knew each other's existence. Faced with Shen Jichang's inexplicable anger, Shen Yunchu did not even show any displeasure or rebellion. She only bowed respectfully and distantly. Yes, father, daughter has taken note. Look, they are both father and daughter, but they have a sense of unfamiliarity that they have just met. Shen Jichang does not call her by her nickname Zhen, nor does Shen Yunchu call Shen Jichang's father. They do not have the kind of coquettishness and flattery that father and daughter should have. Upon closer examination, it seems that she has always been so cold and indifferent to everyone. But in fact, they all care about each other very much. Otherwise, in the previous life, Shen Jichang would not have come to their door with a knife after learning the truth about Shen Yunchu's passing. But it's just that no one wants to put down their face and be obedient. Shen Jichang was a bit displeased, and his face immediately darkened. Shen Yunchu glanced at his face, which was instantly covered in dark clouds, and realized that the next second, he was going to speak up to warn Shen Yunchu. Shen Yunchu spoke up first, Dad. Shen Yunchu suddenly raised his volume, and before Shen Jichang could utter his admonition, his voice was stuck in his throat. His attention was instantly drawn to her, and he lowered his gaze, looking at Shen Yunchu with some displeasure. Shen Yunchu was full of grievances and said, Dad, I brought back the calligraphy class you mentioned last time today. Master Chen said there is still room for improvement, but my daughter is clumsy and I can't tell. Dad, please accompany me to take a look. Upon hearing these words, he met Shen Yunchu's flickering big eyes, and the displeasure in Shen Jichang's eyes instantly subsided. In the end, he just gave Shen Yunchu a fierce glare before standing up and leaving the hall with Bai Yuheng and Shen Zirui first, even ignoring the two women standing up to bid them farewell. Throughout the entire process, Shen Yunchu lowered her eyes without any reaction. It wasn't until Shen Yunchu got up and walked up to her that she looked up with some confusion. Their eyes met, and it was not difficult to notice that Shen Yunchu's gaze at her was somewhat distant and suspicious, even mixed with a hint of vigilance. Shen Yunchu knew where the emotions in her eyes came from, and it was mostly a good deed done by Shen Yunchu. The Shen family did not have many children, and apart from Shen Yunchu and Shen Zirui, she did not dare to provoke them openly. According to Shen Shuyao's temperament, Shen Yunchu, who had a calm and upright personality, naturally became the target of her bullying. Shen Yunchu didn't mind, just pretended not to notice and smiled at her. Sister, let's go together tomorrow so we can be a companion. In the past, if it weren't for Shen Jichang's special orders, the sisters of the Shen family always went their separate ways and rarely went together. Faced with Shen Yunchu's invitation, Shen Qingyue was puzzled but also hesitated whether to agree or not. The second lady beside her immediately smiled and said, very good, very good. Miss San is willing to go with you, so Miss De is naturally happy. Shen Yunchu nodded and said, let's meet tomorrow. As she spoke, she turned around and nodded at Shen Qingyue, then turned her head and left. The two of them standing in the hall looked at each other with a hint of sadness on their faces at night. Shen Yunchu and Lin Lang returned to the yard from the study, and when they looked up, they saw a light shining inside. A 14-year-old girl was standing at the door, as if waiting for her. Noa noa jie. Shen Yunchu walked forward with a hint of helplessness in his expression. It's so late, why haven't you rested yet? Her name is Jiang Yinian, and she is the daughter of a comrade in arms who lived and died with Shen Jichang in the early years. It is said that Jiang Yinian's father was buried by the enemy's sword to cover up for Shen Jichang's evacuation. At that time, Jiang Yinian had just been born, and her mother was difficult to deal with and died without a father or mother. Shen Jichang couldn't bear to see her wandering in his heart, so he brought her back to raise her. End of this chapter.